Magnus Carlsen is undoubtedly the greatest active chess player in the world. He dominates all of his opponents and rarely ever loses. However, the world champion has had a few notable losses. Here are some of those games and what went wrong. First off is his match against the mysterious player A. Despite not being professional at chess, he challenged Magnus at a bar in Oslo, Norway. Magnus starts the game off with white and opens with pawn e4. A decides to mirror that move with pawn e5. The white knight moves to f3, while the black knight moves to c6. These moves develop into what is known as the Roy Lopez opening. The white bishop slides to b5 and the black knight goes to e7. Magnus moves his pawn to c3 and A advances his own pawn to a6. This causes Magnus to retreat his bishop to a4. A then decides to move another pawn forward, this time to h6. The advancing of pawns continue with Magnus's going to d4. A trade occurs which leads to black knight g6. This move is considered a mistake due to it allowing Magnus to control the center of the board after moving his knight to c3. A slides his bishop to b4. Magnus decides to castle in response. The black bishop moves again to c3. Magnus takes it with his pawn and A castles. The white pawn advances to f4. The black bishop shifts to g4. Magnus's queen moves over to e1. He is in a very strong and dominant position. The black knight jumps to d7. The f4 pawn advances to f5. The black knight moves again now to e5. Magnus moves his pawn to h3. The opposing bishop slides to h5. The white pawn advances to g4. This essentially allows Magnus to take a bishop for 2 pawns. After the trade, the f5 pawn moves to f6. This is certainly not the best move that could have been made at the time. The black queen moves up to e5. Magnus's bishop slides down to f4. This allows A to attack with his queen to h5. The opposing pawn captures on g7. The black rook moves over to e8. White's queen shifts to g3. The black knight jumps to f6. All of a sudden, Magnus makes an awful move. He sends his knight to f5. This opens up A to take a free pawn and attack the queen. Magnus tries to recover with queen g4. This turns out to be the finishing blow. That move blunders his queen, which immediately leads to Magnus resigning in disbelief. He had just lost to a normal player in front of a crowd. Next is Magnus Carlsen's game against Judith Polgar, the greatest female chess player ever. Judith starts the game with pawn e4, to which Magnus responds with pawn c5. The reason for this move was to try and fight for the central 4 squares, which happened to be the most dominant spots on the board. Judith decides to move her knight to f3, which causes Magnus to respond with his pawn to c6. Judith moves her next pawn to d4. A few plays of developing pieces later, and Magnus eventually brings his knight to c6. This creates a more intense Taimanov variation of the Sicilian defense. After Judith moves her bishop to e3, Magnus moves his queen to c7. Judith moves her own queen to d2 in response. A few more moves are made and both players are relatively even. Magnus pushes his bishop to e7 while Judith castles. This makes her king very secure. After both of them move their pawns forward, a few pieces are exchanged. Soon after, Magnus moves his bishop to b7. This threatens the pawn on e4 and the security of the middle of the board. Judith pushes her pawn forward to e5, putting Magnus's knight in danger. This forces Magnus to take the g4 pawn with the knight. That sequence of moves plays a large part in his soon-to-come defeat. Judith goes rook g1, pushing the knight to the edge of the board. A few more moves later, and Judith is threatening Magnus's bishop. This is where Magnus makes a game-ending error. With time ticking down, Magnus moves his rook to c8, and Judith moves her bishop to b6. This results in Magnus being trapped. He has no choice but to sacrifice his queen. The critical error proves to be too much for him to overcome, as he soon resigns against the legendary female chess player. He lost in only 19 moves. The final match is against Alexander Morozevich. He is the former number 2 ranked chess player in the world. This would be evident by the way he plays this game. Magnus opens with white pawn c4. Morozevich responds with pawn e6. The white knight jumps to f3, and the black pawn goes to d5. These moves lead to an English opening. The white pawn goes to g6, while the black pawn captures c4. The white bishop slides to g2. Morozevich moves his pawn to c6. This leads to Magnus castling. The b7 pawn advances to b5. Magnus moves his own pawn to a4. This puts Morozevich's middle pawns in danger. The black bishop shifts to b7. Pawns are subsequently traded, and the white bishop moves to b2. A pair of knights and pawns are moved. Morozevich's bishop then slides to e7. Magnus jumps his knight to d2 in response. This finally gives Morozevich an opportunity to castle, which he does. The white rook slides over to c1, while the black knight moves to d5. The white pawn advances to e4. This causes the black knight to retreat onto b6. Magnus advances his pawn again to f4. The other black knight moves to d7. Magnus continues to build up an attack by moving his f4 pawn to f5. The black knight then jumps to c5. This creates another series of trades, and now Magnus is in a dominant position to attack. Morozevich moves his queen to e7. Magnus decides to move his knight to g4. The black bishop moves back to c8, while the white knight shifts to f6. This causes a sizable trade, which is to the advantage of Morozevich. The black bishop moves to f5, and the white bishop goes to e7. Morozevich continues to attack by moving his bishop again to e6. Magnus slides his queen to d1. The other black bishop captures on e7. The e4 pawn advances to e5. Morozevich's knight jumps to d5. Magnus shifts his queen across the board to h5. A couple moves later and the white pawn moves to g5. The black bishop slides to d5, which creates another trade involving the opposing bishop. Pieces continue to shuffle, as Magnus is clearly in a winless position. Eventually, Morozevich protects his king and threatens checkmate. Magnus resigns at this point and shakes hands. He is clearly disappointed by the way the match went. This once again proves that even legends can bleed.